Get down! Get your face on the floor!
I sat down. I'm compliant, sir. There's no need for this.
Crowd's moving. Phones up.
You strut through here in that fancy get up and everyone's supposed to bow?
An officer at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport stopped a man in a U.S. Army dress uniform, looked at his military ID, and decided it was probably fake. Then he forced him to the floor. In front of hundreds of travelers. On a crowded Sunday evening. In full view of dozens of phones already recording. The soldier, Staff Sergeant Darius Wright, back on American soil for less than 72 hours after a covert overseas extraction, didn't fight back. Didn't raise his voice. Kept his breathing steady and his posture deliberate and let the officer finish making the worst mistake of his 16-year career. What Officer Craig Bellingham didn't know was that the sealed envelope sliding across that terminal floor contained classified federal evidence. That Wright hadn't been traveling as a decorated soldier. That he had been traveling as something else entirely. And that the confrontation now being live-streamed to thousands of viewers had just handed federal investigators everything they needed. The settlement figure would come later. So would the prison sentence, the buried complaint files, and the federal investigation that extended far beyond one airport in Atlanta. But all of it started here. On a Sunday evening. On a cold tile floor. With an officer who never once considered that he might be wrong. If stories about accountability and the people who refuse to be erased matter to you, hit the like button, subscribe if you're new here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and tell me whether stories like this one deserve to be heard. Your engagement puts this in front of the people who need to see it most. Hartsfield-Jackson on a Sunday evening operated at a particular frequency, not the frantic pitch of Monday morning business travel, but the dense, unhurried mass of families returning from weekends, students heading back to campus, and connecting passengers navigating the world's busiest airport with the weary efficiency of people who had done it before. Concourse B moved at that rhythm at 6:14 p.m. Luggage wheels hummed against polished tile. Gate agents made announcements that competed with the ambient noise of a terminal that never fully quieted. Staff Sergeant Darius Wright moved through it the way soldiers move through unfamiliar terrain, with controlled awareness, his bearing steady despite the weight pressing down on him from 40-plus hours of movement across military airfields, helicopter extractions, and the particular exhaustion that accumulates when sleep becomes a logistical problem rather than a biological certainty. His dress uniform was immaculate. Every ribbon aligned, every brass button fastened, because the discipline that kept a soldier functional in hostile conditions was the same discipline that kept his uniform presentable when his body was running on nothing. Beneath his left arm, held against his side with deliberate, practiced pressure, was a sealed military envelope, heavy cream stock, Department of Defense classification markings stamped in the upper corner, red lettering visible at close range that identified its contents as material not intended to leave military custody. He was not supposed to put it down. He had not put it down in 14 hours. Officer Craig Bellingham had been working Concourse B for most of his shift. 16 years on the Atlanta Airport Police Department had given him a particular kind of confidence, the settled, unexamined certainty of a man whose instincts had never been seriously challenged by the institution that employed him. He moved through the terminal with the proprietary ease of someone who considered the space his, and when his eyes found Wright moving through the crowd, something in his assessment produced a conclusion that his training should have prevented and his experience should have corrected. He stepped directly into the soldier's path. What followed happened with a speed that the terminal crowd could not immediately process. Bellingham demanded the envelope. Wright's response was measured, precise, and entirely clear. The document was classified. He was not authorized to surrender it to civilian law enforcement, and he was prepared to provide his military identification for verification. He extended the ID with his right hand, the one wrapped in gauze over a wound that had already been stitched once by a field medic before he boarded his transport. Bellingham examined it for a fraction of the time it required. Then his hand moved. The grip closed on Wright's bandaged wrist with enough force that the gauze darkened immediately, fresh red spreading through the layers. Wright did not pull back. He did not shift his weight or alter his posture. He stated, clearly and without heat, that he was not resisting, that he had not moved, that everything occurring was being recorded by the body camera blinking red on the officer's chest. Bellingham shoved him forward anyway. The sound of Wright's knees hitting the tile carried across the nearest gate area with a sharp, flat impact that cut through the ambient noise of the terminal and reached the ears of travelers 20 yards in every direction before their minds had finished processing what caused it. His shoulder followed, then the side of his face. The sealed dossier slipped from beneath his arm on impact and skidded across the polished floor in a slow, rotating arc, coming to rest near a row of plastic seats with its red classification stamp facing upward, legible to anyone close enough to read it. The terminal did not erupt. It did something more unsettling. It stopped. Luggage wheels ceased. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. A child near gate B14 began crying, and the sound carried farther than it should have because the usual noise that would have absorbed it had simply gone away. Phones rose across a 30-foot radius with the synchronized instinct of a crowd that had collectively decided this required documentation. A young woman near the gate had already tapped her screen to go live before Bellingham's partner had finished moving into position at Wright's legs. The second officer, younger, newer, visibly uncertain in every line of his body, took hold of Wright's legs and pressed them flat. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at his partner, and what was visible on his face was not conviction but the uncomfortable calculation of someone who had made the decision to follow rather than intervene, and was already beginning to understand the cost of that decision. Bellingham brought his knee down into the center of Wright's back. Wright's cheek pressed against the cold tile. His breathing remained audible and controlled, not the ragged breathing of panic or struggle, but the deliberate, regulated breath of someone who had been trained to remain functional under physical duress and had chosen, with full understanding of the choice, not to give the officer anything that could be described as resistance. The cuff snapped into place. The torn bandage soaked through completely. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice cut through the silence with the particular authority of someone who did not need a microphone to be heard. A man in a worn veteran's cap had moved to the edge of the circle, and his identification of the soldier on the floor, U.S. Army, active duty, shifted the energy of the crowd in a way that Bellingham either didn't notice or chose to ignore. A second voice followed, announcing professional credentials and the word unlawful in a tone calibrated to be heard and recorded. Bellingham tightened the restraints one additional increment. Sergeant Vanessa Trask came around the corner from the main concourse corridor at 6:22 p.m. 18 years of airport patrol had calibrated her instincts to the specific texture of a situation that had moved past correction into crisis, and she read it before she had fully entered the scene, the crowd formation, the wall of phones, the particular quality of silence that replaced normal terminal noise when something irreversible was happening. Then she saw what was on the floor, and she saw what was 10 feet away from it, and the two details together produced an understanding of the situation's gravity that arrived faster than any briefing could have delivered it. A soldier in full dress uniform. Blood on the tile beneath his hand. And a sealed federal document with classification markings lying in open public view of an international airport terminal. Her instructions to Bellingham were not a negotiation. The resistance in his expression when she spoke did not alter what came next, because Trask had not framed her words as a request. She picked up the military identification that Bellingham's partner still held. She read the name, the rank, the unit. Her eyes came up slowly. The second officer unlocked the cuffs. Wright rose from the floor with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had decided, at some earlier point in the previous several minutes, exactly how he was going to stand up when the moment came, straight, measured, without drama, without concession to the pain visible in the way he held his right hand or the thin line of red that had reopened above his eyebrow during the fall. His posture, as he gained his feet, was indistinguishable from the posture he had maintained walking through the terminal before any of this began. Trask retrieved the dossier from the floor, holding it by its edges with the careful handling of someone who understood, at minimum, that the markings on the envelope meant she was now responsible for a problem significantly larger than a use of force complaint. She keyed her radio and requested the airport police chief by name. The words she added after the request, active duty service member, classified military documents, transformed the call from a supervisory escalation into something the entire department would respond to differently. Chief Julius Pratt arrived within minutes. One look at the red stamp on the envelope was sufficient. He did not ask Bellingham to explain himself. He did not convene a review. He pulled out his phone and dialed the Department of Defense liaison office, and the conversation lasted less than 3 minutes, and when it ended his expression had set into the controlled rigidity of a senior administrator who has just been told that the situation in front of him is no longer his jurisdiction. Everyone stays. Federal authorities are coming. Bellingham stood in the concourse where he had worked for 16 years, and the confidence that had characterized every movement since he'd stepped into Wright's path had begun, in the minutes since Trass arrived, to undergo a visible and irreversible change. The crowd had not dispersed. The phones had not lowered. The live stream that had started near Gate B14 was already being watched by thousands of people who were still watching, and the number was climbing, and somewhere in the city a young woman's phone was broadcasting Concourse B to an audience that would reach millions before morning. 20 minutes after Pratt's call ended, 2 men in dark civilian suits entered the terminal without stopping at a single checkpoint. One carried Army CID credentials. The other held identification from the Defense Intelligence Agency. They moved to the dossier first, secured it with gloved hands, and signed for it on a chain of custody form that formalized, in federal ink, the moment the incident changed categories entirely. Then they asked to see the body camera footage. The door to the conference room at the end of the concourse corridor closed behind them with a quiet, final click, and whatever Bellingham had believed about how this evening would end began its collapse in earnest. The conference room door had barely closed before the federal agents began working. Agent Paul Reynolds of the Army Criminal Investigation Division set his laptop on the table with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that speed and precision were not competing priorities, they were the same thing. The body camera footage loaded without ceremony. No one in the room spoke while it played. The footage was unambiguous in the way that only real events captured without preparation can be: no editing, no framing, no mediation between what happened and what the lens recorded. The terminal. The stop. The examination of credentials that lasted less time than it should have. The grab. The shove. The sound of a soldier's body meeting the floor of an international airport. The sealed dossier spinning across polished tile with its classification markings facing the ceiling of a public concourse. DIA agent Christopher Hale watched the playback without expression until it ended. Then he identified, in flat and specific terms, the legal categories into which what he had just watched was going to fall. Assault under color of authority. Civil rights violations. And, given what was inside the envelope that had just been knocked across the floor of a terminal serviced by 37 international airlines, a national security breach whose paperwork was already being drafted in Washington. Airport Police Chief Julius Pratt absorbed this without argument. The instructions that followed were precise and non-negotiable. Bellingham and his partner were to be relieved of duty immediately. Badges, weapons, radios, and body cameras secured as evidence. No internal interviews conducted before federal investigators completed theirs. The department's usual procedures for handling officer-involved incidents were, effective immediately, superseded by a jurisdiction that answered to a different chain of command entirely. Pratt nodded and made the calls. Across the city, the story was already outrunning the investigation. The live stream that had begun near Gate B14 had not stopped when the conference room door closed. It had continued broadcasting the aftermath, the arrival of Trass, the uncuffing, the federal suits moving through the terminal with the purposeful calm of people who didn't stop at checkpoints. By midnight, the civilian footage had passed 2 million views. By morning, the number had become a different order of magnitude. The image that anchored the coverage was the same across every platform: a soldier in full dress uniform, face against airport tile, blood darkening the gauze around his right hand, while an officer in a department vest stood over him with the settled posture of someone who had never once anticipated consequences. The question that every broadcast, every comment section, and every editorial produced within the first 48 hours was the same: who was this officer, and how had no one stopped him before now? Federal investigators pulled Craig Bellingham's personnel file within hours of the conference room briefing. What it contained did not surprise the agents who read it, because the agents who read it had spent careers learning that files like this one were never as hidden as the institutions protecting them believed. 31 prior complaints over 16 years. The demographic pattern in the complainants was not subtle. Black and Latino travelers, stopped without cause, detained beyond reasonable duration, subjected to searches that produced nothing and explanations that satisfied no one. Each complaint had moved through the department's internal review process and arrived at the same destination: closed, filed, and made invisible under language that varied in phrasing but was consistent in outcome. Misunderstanding. No further action required. Complaint not substantiated. 3 words recovered from an internal email exchange between supervisors would later become central to the federal case. Let it go. A lieutenant's instruction, sent in response to a flagged complaint 7 years earlier, that had been followed without question by everyone who received it. Then the witnesses came forward. A commercial airline pilot described being detained in the same terminal 2 years earlier while in full uniform, his credentials questioned for 45 minutes, his airline never contacted for verification despite his explicit request. His complaint had been closed in a week. A TSA supervisor recounted being accused of trespassing in an area where he had reported for work every day for 9 years. A woman named Simone described a search that lasted more than 30 minutes while her infant cried, causing her to miss her flight, after which she filed a complaint and received no response of any kind. Within 2 weeks, 14 people had come forward. The pattern in their accounts was so consistent it read less like a collection of individual incidents and more like a documented methodology, the same sequence of behaviors, the same dismissal of credentials, the same aggressive certainty, repeated across 16 years with the confidence of someone who had learned, through repeated experience, that nothing would follow. And then the investigation reached the thing that changed everything. The documents inside the sealed dossier were not mission notes. They were not routine classified material of the kind that traveled regularly through military courier channels. For more than a year, Army intelligence and federal agencies had been building a case against an international smuggling network operating through major American airports, money laundering, illegal cargo movement, foreign intelligence connections, and transit routes that exploited security checkpoint vulnerabilities with a precision that suggested inside assistance. The network had links to Iranian intermediary networks. And among the names that had surfaced during the year-long investigation, collected through overseas intelligence gathering and now contained in the evidence Wright had been carrying under his arm through Concourse B, was Officer Craig Bellingham. Wright had not been traveling as a returning soldier. He had been functioning as a protected federal courier, moving the final evidentiary package from the overseas operation directly into the hands of investigators stateside. His appearance, standard dress uniform, no special operations insignia, nothing that distinguished him from any other soldier passing through a civilian airport, had been intentional. The assignment required invisibility. He had maintained it through extraction, transport, and 40 hours of transit across military airfields, and he had been 11 minutes from completing it when Bellingham stepped into his path. The officer had stopped the men investigating him. He had assaulted him, exposed classified evidence in a public terminal, and done all of it on camera. The question that federal prosecutors would later put to investigators, and that now lingered over every subsequent development in the case, was whether Bellingham had known. Whether the stop had been what it appeared to be, reckless, racially motivated misconduct by an officer who had practiced it for 16 years without consequence. Or whether it had been something more deliberate. Whether someone connected to the network had identified Wright, and whether Bellingham had been the mechanism of interference. The evidence, as it stood, did not resolve this cleanly. And that ambiguity, that gap between reckless and aware, became the thing that held the public's attention long after the footage had been seen by everyone who was going to see it. Was this the action of an officer who simply couldn't recognize his own bias, or something more calculated? Type aware or reckless in the comments, and explain what you think the evidence actually shows. Federal prosecutors filed formal charges within 3 weeks. Assault under color of authority. Civil rights violations. Obstruction of a federal investigation. The combined charges carried potential sentencing exposure that reached 15 years, a number that landed differently in public discussion than the standard language of accountability, because 15 years made the consequences concrete in a way that administrative suspension and departmental review never quite managed to. Bellingham's department issued a statement distancing itself from his conduct with the careful phrasing of an institution managing liability rather than reckoning with failure. His union did not issue a statement at all. Former colleagues stopped returning calls from reporters. The system that had protected him for 16 years, that had received 31 complaints and produced 31 dismissals, had gone completely silent, because the mechanism of protection only functions when the exposure remains contained, and this exposure had long since exceeded any boundary that internal process could manage. The Pentagon's public statement arrived faster than most observers expected, and its directness was unusual for an institution practiced in measured language. An active duty soldier evacuated from hostile territory had been subjected to racially motivated assault upon his return to American soil. The Army expected full accountability. The statement did not qualify or hedge. It did not express confidence in the ongoing review process or call for patience. It stated an expectation, named its object, and stopped. Military leadership understood something the public was still absorbing. The soldier Bellingham had dismissed on that airport floor had been carrying evidence capable of dismantling an operation that had been running undetected through American airports for more than a year. The irony was structural and complete. The officer's attempt to assert dominance over a man he had decided was unimportant had produced the one outcome that the network under investigation had spent a year working to prevent. The evidence was now in federal custody. The chain of custody was intact. The case would proceed. Wright returned to limited duty without public comment. He gave no interviews. He appeared in no broadcasts. His commanding officer's statement on his behalf was brief and did not elaborate beyond what the Army had already said publicly. In the weeks that followed, as court proceedings began and the weight of video evidence shaped every preliminary motion, Wright remained what he had been in that terminal, present, disciplined, and entirely uninterested in spectacle. The footage had been watched by tens of millions of people. The trial would be watched by far fewer, but its outcome would matter in ways that view counts could not measure. Policy reviews initiated at the federal level, internal reform mandates issued to airport law enforcement departments in 6 major cities, and a legal precedent establishing that classified courier operations carried protections that extended to the physical safety of the individuals conducting them. Craig Bellingham had looked at a decorated soldier returning from hostile territory and seen someone whose credentials were probably fake, whose uniform was probably borrowed, and whose presence in that terminal required his intervention and his certainty and his 16 years of unquestioned authority. He had been wrong about every part of it. And the documentation of that error, the body camera, the civilian phones, the live stream, the classified dossier that federal agents had signed for on a chain of custody form, had transformed his certainty into evidence, and his authority into the thing being prosecuted. Justice, when it arrived in that federal courthouse, would not be loud. It would be procedural, documented, and built from the footage of a man who had stayed still on a cold airport floor and waited for truth to finish its work. It always does. It just sometimes requires someone disciplined enough to let it.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.